Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the ninth webinar, strategic webinar in the EUROCONTROL Stakeholder Forum series. My name is Stephen Moore. I'm the head of ATM Network Operations Division here at EUROCONTROL, the network manager in Brussels. Our discussion today is focused on sustainability issues facing airports and the proven options to boost aviation sustainability through airport airside electrification, all to build back better. Yesterday was Heathrow's 75th birthday. How far have things actually come, and how much farther have they yet to go in terms of sustainability and electrification? If I may progress, we have many sustainability issues facing the airports around us, not least some of the items that you'll see now coming before you, the requirement to reduce those aviation emissions down, but also to consider who pays. Is it going to be offset? Will the carbon offset reduction scheme for airlines pay for the charges that will be required to introduce electrification? Emissions trading schemes, will there be taxes, increased costs for the passenger? All of these will be discussed today in this exciting and interesting webinar. The Green Deal to reduce transport emissions there by 90% by 2050. ACI announcing this week that 235 airports will be net zero carbon emissions by 2050 and 91 will be net zero carbon emissions by 2030. All of those areas there to be discussed as we progress through. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our panelists this afternoon. From left to right there on the screen, we have Richard Emmerink, Director Strategy and Airport Planning at the Royal Schiphol Group, Thomas Lagarde, Head of Product Portfolio and Programs Managing Director Canada at NavBlue, an Airbus company, and finally Maxime Mayhew, CEO of the Smart Airport Systems company there. And so before we begin and before I hand over in turn to the panelists this afternoon, just the usual bit of administration for us. This is an interactive webinar. Please do submit your questions to the panelists and they will appear in the chat for me as the moderator to see and pick up and ask directly to the panelists. Use the Q&A function in Zoom, please, for that, and we will filter the question accordingly. Please do include your name or your area of interest, or at very least, if you have a particular panelist that you're addressing, who you would like to answer the question. Please also note the chat function for this webinar is merely there to highlight if there are any issues with the webinar as opposed to raising questions. We will not be monitoring that, and I certainly won't have access to it as a moderator. So please submit your questions through the Q&A area. I think without further ado, I will turn firstly to our first panelist, Richard Emmerink, the Director of Strategy and Airport Planning there at Royal Schiphol Group. Richard, good afternoon. If I could ask you to introduce yourself and give your introduction to those people connected.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Well, I'm Richard Emmerink, Director of Strategy and Airport Planning at Schiphol Airport, and I would like to share a few thoughts from Schiphol Airport about how to tackle sustainability. I will try to share my screen now. I hope you can see it.
It's great, thank you.
Yes, thanks. So, well, let's first not forget COVID, by the way, because we are still in a crisis and we have to recover from this crisis. But after we've hopefully recovered from this crisis in some time from now, we have a big dilemma that we're facing. Because clearly we want future generations to also explore this world and to fly and to travel. But we can't continue to do it the way we do it right now. Now, this is, I just saw your 3.8%, Stephen, on CO2 emissions. If you add the non-CO2 effects as well, then I think aviation is responsible for roughly 6 to 7% of global warming. So we have to do something about it, and the whole world has to go to net zero in 2050. So at Schiphol Airport, we are fully aware of this issue, and we tackled this in the following way. We really put sustainability in the heart of our mission, in the heart of our ambition. And this is shown by the next slide, which is our Vision 2050 slide. And what we are doing for the Netherlands and the world, connecting to the Netherlands, is to connect your world. But the way we want to do that is by creating the most sustainable and high quality airports. And what's important here is that we have defined our future in terms of quality and not in terms of quantity. So it's about the quality of the network, the quality of life, and the quality of service. And those three need to be in balance. So sustainability really at the heart of what we are trying to achieve. Then if we focus now on sustainability, we talk about what we call the pillar quality of life, shown in the middle here. And we have defined quality of life in four issues. On the x-axis, you see circular economy and energy positive. And on the y-axis, you see sustainable aviation and communities. On the x-axis, those are the things that we as an airport company can actually do. This is the stuff we do ourselves. This is not the things for our airlines. This is what we do ourselves. And we've set ourselves a very challenging target. We want to be zero emission airport by 2030. So not minus 55% as the EU said, but we want to be a zero emission airport. But clearly the big challenge for aviation sits with sustainable aviation, here shown on the top. And well, we all know there's no silver bullet here. And we have to really work together, work with the whole chain, and work on electricity, as mentioned in this webinar, but also particularly work on sustainable aviation fuels. And that's what we will do in the future as well. So we are really trying to leapfrog the development of sustainable aviation fuels by partnering with various companies. So for example, we have partnered with the company that's producing biofuels in the north of the Netherlands. We are setting up a project to think of how we can produce synthetic kerosene and so on. So it's at the heart of what we're trying to do. Then if we move to how to make this actually happen, I'll move to the last slide, is we believe there are four steps that we need to take, and we need to take them collectively. And we took them already at the airport, at Schiphol Airport. First, there needs to be an absolute sense of urgency of the issue, that we really have to tackle this together, and it's not going to be easy. Then secondly, it has to be embraced by our vision and by our strategy. So it has to be core of the strategy, core of what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. So it should not just be a sustainability department, it should be part of the strategy. And thirdly, we need tough internal targets. Of course, we are in hard to abate sector, so it will be difficult, but we have to set tough targets and we have to mobilize the environment, mobilize the government. And last but not least, we have to create an action agenda for ourselves, but also for the whole ecosystem. So to determine the steps that we need to take. So I will wrap up. Sustainability in Schiphol's view, it's not a choice for aviation, but it's really our license to operate. And we all need to step up. We all need to change gears in order to make this happen. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that really thought-provoking introduction from the position and views of the Royal Schiphol Group looking forward. And you're very right, of course, at the start of your introduction there around the crisis that's currently ongoing. We can't forget it, which does, of course, bring us back to the who pays principle as well, which I'm sure we'll come on to in the questions and answers. So in the spirit of moving us on to introduce our next panelist, it's my great pleasure to introduce Thomas Legaard, Head of Product Portfolio and Programs and Managing Director Canada at NavBlue. Thomas, good afternoon. Do you hear me?
Yes, good evening. Good afternoon. Do you hear me well?
Yes, we do. Thank you. It's nice to see you. And the floor is all yours, sir.
Thank you. NavBlue, for those who are not familiar, we are an Airbus subsidiary, and we focus on providing software solution and services to optimize really the operation of the airline. And for me, we all know that airline business is a very constrained business, and for their survival, the survival of aviation, of course, sustainability is a must-have. But I think there is a quick point that I want to make is in the mind of many people, sustainability is equal CO2 emission, equal fuel, so it's exactly the same as the profitability of an airline. Well, it's not that easy. And actually, sustainability is a little bit more complex topic. First of all, sometimes fuel consumption is not in the best interest of economical interest of the airline to reduce the fuel consumption, for instance, tankering or type of approaches. And second, you have all the non-CO2 constraints like of sustainability, like the noise, for instance, at airport, which is a very important dimension. So today, I'd like to make two focus on how we see the airport and the surrounding area being a key to improve the sustainability of operation. First of all is the airspace design. The airspace design for us is something that airlines cannot influence and that has a big potential from our experience in reducing the overall impact of aviation on a city. We've been designing probably the most trickiest approaches in the world at all the most trickiest airport, and also designing some large TMAs. In the pre-COVID, it was, I would say, to increase capacity, and we see now a shift of redesigning TMAs to enhance the trajectories and reduce the impact overall. So I think what we have seen is that the use of technologies like PBN can lead to a more predictable, more precise trajectories. So it's continuous descent, continuous climb, respecting the environment. And we have some, I think, some outstanding results at some of our projects. For instance, the simulation shows that Shanghai, the redesign, should increase by 20% the overall capacity of the area, and at the same time reduce every year by 300,000 tons of CO2 emission by having better trajectories. Or the work we did in Bogota, for instance, we have roughly reduced the holding time by 40%, 40, quite significant. The last of our project in Mexico, redesigning the overall Mexico City area, we don't have yet the concrete result, but we see in the numbers that the number of unstabilized and go-around approaches, which are, of course, increasing the complexity and the impact, is reducing significantly. So this is something that I think we should take a look at. The second point that I want to make is about the optimization of the airport operation in itself. And we see that also as a key point. One very pragmatic example. We see that the punctuality or the on-time performance on arrival is much better than the on-time performance on departure or turnaround time. So we see that there is, in discussing with different stakeholders, airport operators, airline, we see that there is a great potential to improve that by having a much better communication between those synchronization through a connected system between airlines and airport. And how will that impact sustainability, you could ask? Well, delay is actually generating a lot of additional fuel consumption. Two examples. First of all, if an aircraft departs 15 minutes delayed, well, they want to respect the schedule. They want to get the next connection. So what they're going to do, they're going to speed up over the flight. And so, for instance, an easy calculation is to recover 10 minutes delay on a 1 hour and 30 flight with an A320neo is 600 kilo of additional fuel, as simple as that. Also, if you have delay at the turnaround, what happens very often is you're going to generate holding time. You're going to generate aircraft on the ground that are using idling, and waiting for the gate to free up. All of that can easily add 100 to 300 kilograms of fuel consumption per flight. These amounts are significant. So reducing delay, increasing punctuality is actually reducing the environmental impact. And so my conclusion there is to say that, and it's a good transition, I think, for the next speaker, is to say that, well, anything we can do to optimize on the ground, to use electrical equipment on the ground, is going to reduce the time where engines are running, and which is good, but it requires synchronization on the ground between the different stakeholders. So having a better communication platform, synchronization and predictability of operation is key to reduce the environmental impact of the aviation.
Thank you, Thomas, for that very insightful introduction from your perspective on the subject of electrification. Clearly, we're talking electrification airports, but we do obviously understand and expand into that sort of immediate airspace, and the highlights there of the airspace design and the optimization of that airport operations is really key. So just before I turn to our next, introduce our next speaker, we've got over 200 people, over 200 people connected right now. Please do utilize the question and answer function within the Zoom platform. I already see very kindly someone has submitted one question, but please don't be shy. Put your questions in the Q&A functionality of the Zoom platform so that I can see them and then I can address them to the panelists in due course. So thank you for that, for everyone who's engaged in the webinar. It is my great pleasure to introduce Maxime Mehu, the Chief Executive Officer of Smart Airport Systems now, as your third and final panelists before we move into the question and answer session. Maxime, I hope you can hear me. Good afternoon. It's over to you.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Yes, I can hear you. I'll try to be brief. Good afternoon, everyone. So our company, Smart Airport System, has one single mission, is to reduce emissions at airports, but very importantly, at the same time, generate a cost savings, a financial incentive to the airline. We believe that the transformation, the green transformation of airports will go through an incentive to airlines and not an additional cost. So we reduce emissions through two distinctive solutions that we deploy at airports on the ground. The first one on the left side, called APU off, is powering electrically and conditioning the aircraft cabin on the ground, reducing the APU usage to the very, very minimum with no investment from airports nor airlines. And on the right side, the engine off, deploying the taxi bot, allowing airlines not to use the main engines during the taxi. If we look in terms of emission at an airport, the aircraft operation is the main source of CO2. What you can see on the left side, the aircraft cycle represents roughly 55% of total airport emissions. And we are addressing, on the middle image, 52% of the aircraft emissions, so APU and taxiing, which represents roughly 30% of the total airport emissions. If we look at the APU represents around 8% of total airport emission. The objective is to turn off APUs as soon as the aircraft arrives at the stand, up to 5 minutes before departure. What is very important is a very accurate monitoring of the APU and of the process is needed on site to make sure that emissions are reduced. We can deploy solutions through either fixed or mobile equipment. And again, very importantly, there is no investment required from airlines nor airports. So the benefits are quite significant in terms of reduction of emissions. You reduce up to 90 or 100% of emissions compared to APU usage, the difference between 90 and 100 being either diesel units or electrical equipment. The cost savings for airlines are massive. We're talking about 30 to 40% of cost savings compared to APU operating cost. And there is no investment, no risk neither from airlines or airports, because airlines are guaranteed to pay always less than the APU operating cost. We are building a network, what we call the APU of global network. So some of your airports might be already partner or not. And we aim to build that network very drastically worldwide to allow airlines to save fuel, save money everywhere they fly, again, with no investment. If we look at the taxiing, the second solution, the taxiing represents roughly around 20% of total airport emissions. The taxi bot, in a very brief description, so it's similarly to a pushback, except that it's not a pushback. Right after the pushback, the control of the tractor is transferred to the pilot. The pilot takes control of the equipment and is towing, in fact, the aircraft without the engines running up to the runway. So engines are off. any load on the nose landing gear is very reduced and controlled and monitored at any time. That's one of the main advantages of the taxibot. And very importantly, you avoid the warm-up sequence just after the pushback, because directly after the pushback, the control is transferred to the pilot and the taxiing is starting. So that's, of course, reducing congestion at airports. The safety driver is there in the taxibot to do the pushback, and of course, after the disconnection area, to bring the taxibot back to the next mission. If we look at the taxibot solution versus sustainable aviation fuel that Richard mentioned before, and that is very often mentioned in the press, today, the sustainable aviation fuel costs 3 times more than the jet fuel. If we compare, for reducing the same quantity of CO2 emissions at an airport, if we compare the taxibot and sustainable aviation fuel, we can see that the taxibot is today cost neutral. So there is no investment or no additional cost, so to speak, for the airport or the airline, when SAF would generate 17 million euros cost, additional cost. So of course, taxibot and sustainable aviation fuel can be deployed in parallel, but taxibot is clearly today the cheapest alternative to reduce emissions on the ground, and the cost remains a significant key driver to accelerate the green transformation at airports. So to finish, that slide is just showing the potential of ground operations emission reduction. We can see on the left that, in fact, ground operations are generating a significant portion of the total aviation CO2 pollution, between 5 to 11%. So it's not massive compared to in-flight. However, to address this pollution today, it's a lot easier on the ground than during flight once you have changed your aircraft by the new version of A350 or NEOs. It means that 30 to 40% of midterm emission improvement potential is on the ground. And the solution that we propose are available today, and their cost is negative. So it's either cost neutral or we generate cost savings to either airlines and airports. So we believe that this is the way to go to accelerate the green transformation at airports. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maxime. Wow, what a collaboration there of from the 3 panelists, from the desire of the airport and the future view of sustainability, that sense of urgency, the vision and the strategy with some tough targets and an action agenda, through to the optimization at the airport and the airspace redesign immediately around airports, to the solution. There we have it. The solution to reduce 30 to 40% there, if I've understood the figures correctly, of the midterm ground emissions is on our doorstep. And in answer to one of the questions that's come up through the Q&A, and I thank people for submitting those now, what's the cost? There's no cost. It's free. That's not fair. There's no cost. It's cost neutral. So within 20 minutes of this webinar starting, we've got the answers. This is truly a really exciting webinar to really now start digging into some of this a little bit. I'm going to turn to a question that was raised right at the very start. Richard, it's for you really, but possibly also for, sorry, just scroll that back up again, possibly also there for SAS, so Maxime as well. But let's start with Richard. What if sustainable solutions lead to more complex ground handling operations at the airport? How can we really introduce sustainable solutions be implemented without actually affecting the efficiency and the safety of the airport? So Richard, from the operations side at the airport, perhaps, how can we introduce these sustainable systems if it's going to potentially increase the complexity on the ground handling?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. That's a very good question. And actually, one of the slides shown by Maxime was taken from Schiphol Airport because we've been working very well together on a pilot, on a taxibot pilot. And the question raised is particularly the one that we need to answer going forward, because the person asking the question is absolutely right. Particularly at a constrained airport, it will lead to more complexity. So apart from having the taxibot, you also need infrastructural adjustments. And you also need other procedures and probably move towards more autonomous airport ideas. And that's exactly what we're doing with pilots. If we talk about Schiphol, we have an objective to, in 2030, to have a very serious taxi bot operation. Because as you know, at Schiphol Amsterdam Airport, we have particularly one runway, which is quite far out. You might have noticed it takes some time. It's quite far out. So this one is particularly useful for the taxi bot. And as Maxime rightly said, it really saves a lot and it saves money, but it also saves issues for local air quality. And we have a lot of issues with local air quality in terms of nitrogen, but also in terms of fine particles and ultrafine particles. So all those issues can be tackled on the ground with the taxi bot, and it represents a very fair share, as was shown by Maxime, of the emissions on the ground. So that's why we are so actively engaged with partners like SAS to move this forward and to learn what needs to be done in a busy operation to introduce this concept.
Thank you. That's really an interesting response there from the airport perspective. Maxime, so from your perspective then, maybe just to reiterate, but from the management of that perspective, to reduce with the answers there on the air side, from the SAS perspective, what do you think is the summary that you'd like to give to the question, which has ironically just disappeared off my screen?
So, of course, complexifying a little bit the process, it will. We will not lie to you. It's clear that it is easier to push on a button to start APU or use engines to taxi, but you need to reduce emissions. So the taxi bot is a little bit more complex than the APU you have to implement, because obviously the taxi bot has to come back. So you create an additional flow of vehicle. And clearly, there might be some very minor adjustments that are required in terms of infrastructure, but the majority of airports, they don't have to be adjusted in terms of infrastructure. Of course, the air traffic control has these vehicles coming back, so it's adding a little bit of complexity. But again, today, the taxi bot is the only green taxiing certified solution available. So what choice do we have if we want to tackle these 20% emissions? But the collaboration with Schiphol Airport has been fantastic. We demonstrated with the first pilot that the complexity could be managed easily. So we are on that process now to deploy, hopefully, the taxi bot at that airport and numerous additional airports. But Schiphol has been also paving the way to sustainability, as we all know. And that's why we normally do a pilot. We assess the complexity eventually that we need to tackle before massively deploying the taxi bot.
Thank you. Just before I move on and perhaps slightly adapt the questioning slightly, there was one follow-up question, Maxime, specifically for you here on the subject of taxi bots. This isn't a taxi bot webinar, let's be clear, but let's take the question as it's fairly presented. When comparing taxi bot and sustainable aviation fuels, as you did in the presentation, what assumptions are being made? Do you actually consider the use of 100% blend in the tanks, for example?
No, we used for Paris Airport the Green Deal that will materialize in 2022. We use, I think, 2 or 3% of sustainable aviation fuel, and we compare, in fact, the emissions that you reduce using SAF and the emissions that you reduce with the taxi bot, and we compare the cost, and the difference was a factor of 8. So the sustainable aviation fuel today is 8 times more expensive than the taxi bot solution for the same quantity of emission that to reduce.
Okay, thank you.
May I just add something, Stephen, to this?
Richard, yeah.
Because I guess the question, the person asking the question wonders whether taxi bot is still useful when there are sustainable aviation fuels fully around. But then I can really, in a way, disappoint the person. It will take a long time because before we will have sufficient sustainable aviation fuels. Recently, a report, Destination 2050, came out, providing a pathway to 2050. And even if we have the right amounts of sustainable aviation fuels, they need so much renewable energy that it will always be useful to use a taxi bot for taxiing at an airport, because aircraft engines, they're really brilliant for flying, but a little bit less brilliant for taxiing.
Thank you. I wanted to try and turn it around a little bit and introduce Thomas back into the conversation from this perspective. Thomas, you spoke about the optimization of the airport operation as well as the airspace. We'll come on to the airspace shortly, hopefully. But from the airport optimization perspective, with the electrification on the airport, in this case, the TaxiBot solution, is the price of electrification reduction in capacity, thereby reduction in profit generating for both the airport and the airline?
Clearly, we're gonna have to. We see that the airport management compared to the airline management is late. Airlines have had OCC managing their flight, tracking all their, I would say, their resources and optimizing them very precisely. In airport, we see the concept of APOC emerging, but it's just at the beginning. And what we see there is that, yeah, the management of the different assets of the airport and getting all the TaxiBot at the right time together with the aircraft, and then managing the flow, just like you would manage a flow of airplane in the sky. We need to get there, because we cannot reduce the capacity. I mean, maybe we could use COVID time where the traffic is a little bit down to do some trials, but it's going to come back. So clearly, airport will have to learn, I think, from how airlines and NSP are managing the flow of aircraft in the air to manage the different flows on an airport. And so there will need some optimization, I think, tools to do that, because today the optimization of the ground movement is only beginning.
Okay, thank you. So if I've understood you correctly then, Thomas, you do think that capacity can be maintained with solutions such as the TaxiBot then, with a slightly different approach to perhaps that's been used before?
Oh, I think it's not going to be an option to reduce the capacity. Okay, using TaxiBot will be successful only if you can maintain capacity. Otherwise, this solution has no future. So it means that airports have to adapt and to propose a way to manage that so that the capacity is constrained. I see no airport realistically saying I'm going to reduce the number of movement I have just to use the TaxiBot, right? So they have to find a solution.
It's a good question. Richard, there's a question that's come up which perhaps you could answer with regard to the view from Schiphol. How many taxi towing vehicles would you need in a major hub like Schiphol?
The honest answer is we do not know yet. We have to find out. And a lot depends on what Thomas just said, how we can optimize the ground movements. And I see all these developments really going hand in hand. I mean, we need optimized ground movements. We need more autonomous ground movements. We need more computerized ground movements. That will also make it safer, because often failures, at the end of the day, there's a certain element of human error in. Of course, there can be human error in algorithms as well, but generally it tends to be safer. So we need to resolve those issues, and that will determine how many we will need. And then, of course, at Schiphol, given the fact that the runway is further out, we will need more than airports that have the runways relatively nearby. But having said that actually makes the business case for the TaxiBot probably better, as I mentioned before. Thomas.
Thank you. Thomas, sir.
Yeah, I think if you look at the technology today, airplanes are able to depart and fly on themselves and then land, okay, being separated. And on the ground, which is an operation which is significantly safer and at a speed that has nothing to do with the airspeed, we do nothing. So automation of the ground movement with optimization is certainly something that we need to investigate, and that's a challenge that I'm sure can be handled by aviation.
Thank you. Maxime, did you want to come in on the point just regarding the capacity issues there, and how many TaxiBots? Have you done any modeling? How many would be needed at a hub airport?
Yes, so in terms of flow, as I mentioned, the taxibot, of course, brings some movements to go back from the disconnection area to the next mission. But on the other side, the taxibot is also helping to reduce the congestion, because you don't have the waiting time just after pushback, which is increased with the new engines generation, such as the Neo, could be up to 6 or 7 minutes. And then, of course, you congest the airport. So it's improving the fluidity of the airport. What we believe is an airport from the size of Schiphol Airport up to roughly 20 units would be maybe required, between 15 and 20 units. Something like that, but we are looking at that with Schiphol Airport. And at the end of the day, we also aim to have that taxibot available fully electric, making sure, and why not autonomous, because originally it was designed to be autonomous, but to get the certification from Boeing and Airbus, we finally decided to have a safety driver inside the machine. So we are working on that. But again, in terms of quantity, it's not a large figure.
Okay, thank you. Before we leave taxibot, there's just this one last question. There are lots of questions still in there about taxibot, so I want to change the subject. But the last question, which is quite an interesting one, I think, are the emissions arising from the return of the taxibot, i.e. from uncoupling from the aircraft at the runway, factored into the emission reductions that you presented, Maxime?
Yes, absolutely. So we will take everything into account.
Thank you. That was a nice, easy one to, for now, wrap up the taxibot. So if you've submitted a question on the taxibot and we haven't covered it, I'm sorry, but there are other subjects that I think it's important for us to cover as well. To which point, the next question on the list is around the APU-off solution. So Maxime, staying with you, would the APU-off solution be a better option economically and in terms of emissions, compared to substituting the aircraft APU by a fuel cell, for example, Airbus Zero-E aircraft, and so on and so forth? And then I'll move to Thomas. So firstly, Maxime, APU off, what's the benefits, and are there some other options there instead?
Obviously, when the APU is replaced by a fuel cell, you don't need APU off anymore, because it's not generating emissions. But the time to achieve that will take, minimum 10 to 15, either 20 years. And to the opposite of the taxibot that is complexifying a little bit the operation, the APU off service does not complexify anything. And it's reducing the noise in the environment of people, so increasing safety. And in fact, APUs have never aimed to be used on the ground. They are due to a bad habit, and this is what we are fighting against. And we have very, very good success rate when talking to airports and deploying that solution, which is an easy one, generating cost savings for the airlines, reducing massively the pollution, and extremely easy to implement. So
thank you. Thomas, from your perspective then, the future of aircraft, APUs being replaced by a fuel cell or future hydrogen-powered aircraft entirely, what are your views there from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the future. I think the aircraft architecture are still very much influenced by the need for autonomy. And not making use of everything that is on the ground, because of the diversity of environment that we used to face in the world at different airports. So I think the globalization is helping that. But as you know, the aircraft architecture is evolving very slowly, like Maxime was saying. So yeah, definitely, I think the next generation of aircraft will incorporate more use of ground systems at the airport and more electrical systems. So that's a trend, but it's going to require airport to invest and to be ready. But I think it's a trend.
Thank you. And just to stay with you, Thomas, for a minute, you said in your presentation, your introduction, that airport optimization in itself, without necessary additional items such as the APU off or taxibot or other solutions, just optimizing airports could make a significant difference even now. Why haven't we done that? Why hasn't that happened?
So what we have noticed today is that the reluctance to share information. Today, there is not enough sharing of information between the different stakeholders. And we understand this is airlines, they don't want to share all their data on passengers. Same for airports, because there are some very important economical aspect to it, of course. And we see that there is that reluctance. And so then the transparency is not there and the synchronization is not there. So we think that the emergence of APOC and the emergence of platforms of collaboration where KPIs can be shared and not raw data would allow to do that. So I have little stories like that where airlines and airports are not actually displaying the right information in terms of delay of flight, just to care, for instance, for the passengers to stay more time in the duty-free. Okay, this is real life example that we have seen. So we need to have better information so that the ecosystem works well. So today, because as I explained very simply, delays equals environmental impact. So we need to be better at that, and we need to have a better collaboration between the stakeholders.
Okay,
today, this is not happening.
Thank you, Thomas. So that is a beautiful segue, if I may be so bold, to introduce back into the conversation Richard. From your perspective, clearly from your presentation and from what is widely known, Schiphol ahead of the game in many aspects here in terms of its view. You spoke about getting those tough targets and an action agenda. How would you respond there to Thomas in terms of that information sharing first? And then I'll follow up with a question that someone's raised about forecasting.
Well, I see the points that Thomas raised also at Schiphol Airport, but it is improving. It is really improving. And it's improving. Why? Because we, as a constrained airport, we have to work together better, because otherwise we just can't increase the capacity. So we have to work much better together. Point one. Then point number two, what we're debating here is sustainability. And we like to follow what we call the abatement curve. So first do the smart stuff, which basically costs pretty much nothing. And there's a lot around. And I think that the things that Thomas is talking about are things that actually reduce usage of fossil fuels, let's say. And those are the first things we as a society should do in terms of becoming more sustainable, because it ticks all the boxes. It ticks even the financial box. So yes, I mean, the more, well, we have these kind of sessions, and the more we talk about it and the more constrained we become, the better we will start to work together, which is absolutely needed.
Excellent. But if I've understood you correctly there, Richard, that's working together with the immediate airport stakeholders. Is that working together with a competitor airport over the border in the next country to drive down the overall emissions caused by aviation?
Sustainability for us, even though we said we want to be the most sustainable airport, is not an issue that we want to compete on. We want to help other parties as well to move them forward, because we have a challenge together. We do not have a challenge alone. And of course, we believe that there's something in it for us as well, because we believe that in the future, and that's also true for airlines, in the future, passengers will more and more search for the more sustainable solutions. In any case, that's the path that we will move towards. So we will make sure that passengers and the people around will know that if they want to use the most environmentally friendly hub, they have to transfer at Schiphol Airport. And so there's something in it for us as well. But really, the bigger goal that we're trying to achieve is the key.
Thank you. Thomas, did you want to come back there? I saw you raise your hand, sir.
Yeah, I think the collaboration between the players and including the competitors, I think aviation is reaching the limit of individual optimization. The next optimization is really the collective one. And if I may give a very short example, the advanced work we are doing at Airbus about the project name is called Fellow Flight, is having aircraft flying together like birds. And so at a reduced distance. And so you have a very significant, actually fuel reduction for the second and third in particular, when the aircraft is flying over the wake, is surfing on the wake of the others. But we need as aviation to provide some mechanism for this kind of collaboration and then business model so that you can have a compensation between the different actors that do that. So yeah, collaboration of competitors is needed if we want to reach really the sustainability.
Thank you. So there's still quite a few questions that we haven't had time yet to address, and I'm mindful of the time that we have available for the webinar. We have over 300 people connected, so let's push forward to the last sort of 15, 16 minutes here and try and capture as many of these questions as we can. Maxime, I'm going to turn to you next, I think, because there's a question here that talks about the aerodrome management has been mentioned as general aerodrome management, not specific, are a bit lagging behind the aircraft operator management in terms of their ability and fast-paced opportunities to respond to the requirements of, in this case, sustainability. But what's the thought about the regulatory bodies here? So perhaps more from an independent position, Maxime, from the regulation side, how difficult is it, for example, to get these solutions certified? How difficult might it be for an aerodrome to introduce these with regard to the very rightly but safety-conscious regulatory authorities that we have?
So that's a very good question. So the taxi bot has had to be certified as an aircraft part by aircraft manufacturers such as Boeing and Airbus. It took a lot of energy and time and money. So of course, this was needed because it's touching the aircraft. In terms of regulation from governments, me personally, I don't understand why we still allow APUs to be operated when there is an alternative, or forcing the alternative when that alternative is not generating a cost. And this is really our fight, is to make sure that everybody knows that this solution exists, that this is really generating savings, and that this is reducing the emissions. So it should be mandatory. But it takes some time to achieve such an objective. But we believe that more and more, with the commitments taken by the states, it will have to be transformed into commitments to airports and to airlines to really reduce their emissions and then use such solutions. But the regulation should be a little bit more active, certainly, when solutions are existing.
Thank you. Richard, I don't know whether you want to possibly present an airport perspective there from the regulations. If not, I've got a question that would be coming to you on forecasting. So did you want to add anything to the regulatory side there?
Well, I think regulators in general, they have an important role to play. And I think it's not for nothing that stuff is regulated. But as Maxime says, I mean, I think in light of the greater good, we need to speed this process up a little bit. We've seen with COVID how quickly we can now regulate and certify vaccines. We all will figure out in 10 years whether that was the right thing or not, but we'll find out. So also with this, we need to do that. Forecasting.
Thank you. Thank you. So if I stay with you then, there's a question here about forecasting that I mentioned before but didn't actually raise. You spoke about these tough targets, KPIs and so on and so forth from the environment perspective. Someone's raised a question about how important do you think it is to have in the future tools that will allow the forecasting of the medium-term environmental impact of airports?
Well, I would say that we have that forecasting already, and we are toughly regulated on this, and quite rightly so, because we operate in a densely populated area. And on top of this, in the Netherlands particularly, we have a nitrogen issue. So this is all already done, I would say, but more and more information will come out about actually how damaging certain emissions are, because often science is not yet fully certain about the long-term impacts of certain emissions. That will come out, but again, there we also like to take a proactive stance. One of the reasons why we're really pushing with Maxime and also KLM and partners and other airlines at Schiphol Airport and air traffic control, really pushing this taxi bot example.
Thank you. I don't see the other panelists wanting to interject on that point, which is fine, because there are a couple of other areas I'd like to cover before we sort of try and summarise and wrap up. It's been mentioned already in passing. This requires the entire engagement of all the stakeholders in aviation, not just the colleagues working at airports or in air traffic, but the pilots, the airlines, everyone. How do we bring the people along with us? How do we get that change in mindset into the aviation industry? We know there are solutions. We know there are opportunities. Thomas has spoken very eloquently about the opportunities for optimization without any investment. Maxime has offered cost neutral or even cost benefit solutions. And Richard has talked about the future there with regard to how we can become net zero before 2050, in many cases at major international hubs. How do we get people into the same place to understand that this is manageable and the right thing to do now? I don't know. Let's start with Thomas, because you're first on my screen. Thomas, have you got any thoughts there straight away? How do we engage with the people and get them back into this future-looking world where we can make a difference and we can do it now?
Well, thank you for the question. It's not an easy one. I think airport operators have a leading role to play, because the approach is centered around one location, and you have many stakeholders, so you cannot, I think, rely. So I think for me, airports should step up there and take the leading role in coordinating that. I think they have to get better involved there, and also. Of course, we have, I think it was said by Richard, we have to put some constraints. We know that without constraints, we are generally, the stakeholders are less innovative, less prone to change. So we need to put some constraints, and then maybe, the airport charges could be an incentive. About getting greener and getting more sustainable. So that's my view. I think it's really a tough question. In the past, there was that concept of best equipped, best served, to try to have aircraft equipped with the latest technology. This is a concept that has kind of failed. I think I've not seen it really implemented anywhere in the world. So constraint looks to me the only way.
Okay, thank you. Maxime, if I can turn to you next then. How do we engage the people? How do we get people in all areas of the stakeholder environment in aviation, from the passenger through to the regulator, engaged in making a difference now?
Yeah, I think, with existing solutions, by charging the solution if it's used or not, and when it's cost neutral, that will of course encourage airlines to use the existing solutions. I believe that we cannot create an additional financial burden on the airlines. The airlines are evolving in a very competitive environment. They are suffering even more with the COVID. Now airports are also suffering with the COVID. So obviously the capex and investment is very important, but clearly the airport has a role to play, and Schiphol Airport is playing the game with the taxi bot, investing in that technology, in that research, and Schiphol has always been leading the way in trying to reduce also APUs for a very long time. So the green mission is clearly there, but more airports should be encouraged by their own governments, and then the regulatory body has a role to play, certainly pushing airports to look and to reduce emissions whenever there are solutions available. So that's what I believe we should focus on.
Thank you. Finally, then, on the point of the people, Richard, if I can ask you the question in two areas first. First of all, obviously from the airport perspective, how are you engaging your colleagues at Schiphol into this tough target environment, getting them to change their mind? And how do you influence the passengers who are ultimately, in some cases, going to follow the cheapest ticket?
Well, let's first comment on the credits of Maxime. I mean, this is Schiphol Airport, but together with its whole ecosystem. So together with its KLM, other airlines, EasyJet, and so on, air traffic control, the handler. So this is indeed, as you say, this is a stakeholder game. You have to do it together. So this is, I think, point number one. How to engage the public and the stakeholders. I think that in many areas, actually, the public is much further ahead than the aviation sector is, to be honest. They really want us to move fast, but they often forget that we are a hard to abate sector. So I think, how can you engage people? Well, you can engage people by showing that you're doing things in the right order. So I mentioned the abatement curve. We have to do things in the right order, not start with the most expensive things now. Start with the most bang for your buck emission type investments. And then lastly, I think to the public, we have to be honest. And honesty means that it's going to cost money. Particularly the long-term solutions in terms of sustainable aviation fuels. It was mentioned they're 3 times more expensive now. This is based on biomass. If you base it on synthetic fuels, it's much more even. This will come down because the name of the game then is about scaling. So how do we scale these technologies so that the cost will come down? But it's a fairy tale to think that it will be of the same cost level of the fossil fuels. So the cost of aviation will go up. And we as economists, we call these external effects, and they have to be priced, whether we like it or not. That's what we need to do as an aviation sector. But again, we have to do this smart. We need transition paths with clear objectives and smooth transitions so that we can all be part of this transition.
Thank you. Wow, what a collection of answers from each of you there with regard to the people thing, the real core of making the difference. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to ask you each to wrap up perhaps with a 30-second, 1-minute truth, if you will, with regard to what has changed for you in the last 50 minutes in what you've heard and discussed amongst yourselves since the start of our discussions. And then, in the same breath, if you will, what do you want the audience participating today to take away from your perspective? So what has changed for you, if anything, and if not, what's been reinforced perhaps? And then secondly, what's your last words to the participants online, 300 plus already? Thomas, may I start with you, please?
Thank you. So I think it's very encouraging to be speaking in this panel, because I see that there are things moving and initiatives and people like Richard pushing their organization. So that's very encouraging to me. And I think we should have more of these kind of multiple stakeholder meetings. As a conclusion, I think I want to kind of quote the CEO of Airbus, who was in a talk show lately, you know, because there is a very strong aviation bashing from the public. And he was a bit more offensive. He said, well, you know, we're going to manage the zero emission of aircraft, and then we're going to become the most sustainable means of transportation. Because when we transport somebody from point A to point B, we don't have to destroy the ecosystem by building roads or rail tracks, all of that. So I think it's very. I like the vision. I think it's a right target for us. For aviation, and aviation has the potential to become the most sustainable means of transportation. That's our future.
Thank you. Maxime, if I can come to you with the same less than a minute wrap up with regard to what's changed, if anything, for you since we've started our discussion today, and what's your takeaway for people connected?
I mean, there are a lot of questions on the taxi bot, which is not new, but they are precise and accurate. And so it was very nice to see. As a takeaway, I believe if you are an airport operator, there are solutions that are existing to reduce up to 40% your emissions without any investment, and also increasing the attractivity of your platform for your customers, because they would be very keen to use those. So that's my takeaway. If you are interested, feel free to reach our company.
Thank you very much, Maxime. And then Richard, from your perspective.
It's very encouraging to see that we are all working on the same issues and that we actually strengthen each other with the solutions, and that we need to combine those solutions to really make a difference. And then to the public, I would say that really push your company towards the next level in sustainability. And if they're really particularly financially focused, then make sure that and tell them that this is actually also the right strategical move to make.
Thank you. Just before we wrap up, we're very close to our hour closing now. I was excited before we started this webinar, and thanks to you panelists in particular, but also, of course, to the people connected who raised the questions, and of course to the technical team supporting all of this. What a tremendous webinar with some very interesting concepts discussed. We know there's the political will to address sustainability in aviation. We know that's there for the electrification at airports. We know there's the technical maturity in some cases to deploy solutions, but also in other cases just to make a difference without needing those technical developments by looking at the optimization at airports in a different way. We know that society expects these changes, but if I may quote you, Richard, at the end there, it's a fairy tale to think this comes without a cost. It has been my great pleasure to moderate this webinar. I thank all of the panelists, Richard Emmerich, Thomas Legalliard and Maxime Mayhew for joining us. Please stay tuned for our next webinar on aviation standardization on the 2nd of June, that's next week. Please take care, look after yourselves, and consider and continue to focus on the sustainability for the future of aviation. My name's Stephen Moore. Thank you very much and good afternoon.